consciousness. So we have with us Professor Bindu M. Kutti, Professor, Department of Neurophysiology, Associate Dean of Basic Sciences, and Officer in Charge, Center for Consciousness Studies, NIMHANS, Bangalore. Her research focuses on understanding the perspectives of the cognitive reserve capacities of the brain and understanding of the neurobiology of consciousness along the illness to wellness spectrum in sleeping and waking. Ma'am is going to speak on understanding consciousness from the meditative brain, a neuroscientific perspective. Ma'am, please.
Greetings to you all. My pranams to Swami Atmapriyananda, and greetings to all moms and brothers. And I take this opportunity to thank you all for inviting us to be a part of this. We are really enjoying the talks, and those two talks from Swami Atmapriyananda and Swami Sarvapriyananda. So what an insightful talks. And I must confess here that, see, when we talk about or understanding consciousness from a neuroscientific perspective, we have got a lot of limitations, especially the neuroscientists have got a lot of limitations. So we try to understand something that, as Swami Sarvapriyananda said, that these are all objectives, actually, objects of contemplation, not consciousness at all. So, and we neuroscientists have a lot of limitation that we need to have some yardsticks to measure these, the so-called consciousness, what we study in terms of brain activity. So with all these limitations, I think I will try to share with you some of our studies we have carried out in the past 20 years. So in my talk, in the first 10 minutes, I'm thinking of talking about the history of neuroscience, how the neuroscience, the area, the science of neuroscience have been developed, and how that enabled us to undertake studies to understand consciousness, especially from a neuroscientific perspective. So as you all know, we human beings are endowed with many internal virtues, many higher mental capabilities, cognitive capabilities. All we believe that it is because of the highly evolved brain. And we didn't have much understanding about this, the capabilities of the brain or the mind until the beginning of the 20th century. This is because the behaviorism dominated those days, and the behavioral psychologist considered brain as an unapproachable black box, and the mental functions cannot be studied, because they believe that if you want to study behavior, there should be some observable action from the organism. So if there is something, some observable actions are there, then only you can study the behavior. So if mental functions are unobservable, it is no use studying the brain and the mind. So that was the concept existed in the beginning of 20th century. But then, yeah, so in this context, I would like to mention about the contributions of Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov, he's a Russian physiologist. He has contributed immensely towards the understanding of brain and mind through his classical conditioning studies. So classical conditioning experiments, he has proved that the behaviors can be conditioned. And his intention was to study if the behaviors can be conditioned, the underlying brain and the mind there may be some changes occurring in the underlying brain and mind. So that was his contention. And even before him, the father of, we can say father of psychology, William James. William James has studied human behavior extensively, and he used to use the term behavioral plasticity very extensively to talk about the capability of a human being to change their attitude, to change their behaviors. And so then onwards, we can see that the golden era of neuroscience began, And by 1930s, up to 1930s, we can say that the dogma existed in the, in neuroscience is that we have the adult brain is highly immutable. That is, once the brain attains the adult structure, it is not possible to mute the brain connections and even its thought processes. And then the experiments initiated by Donald Hebb, he's a Canadian psychologist, and he has observed that, he has left his experimental rats in the laboratory. They were able to freely move and explore the environment. And then he has observed that these animals have showed higher cognitive capabilities when compared to the rats reared in small home cages. And he has postulated this Hebbian theory, saying that the cells that fire together wire together. So he says that experience, any experience can modulate your brain functions, modulate your brain connectivity. So that is the term, the plasticity. This is an eye-opener for, or it is this created a paradigm shift in our understanding of brain and mind. And that has, we started understanding the phenomenon of neuroplasticity. So brain is endowed with this phenomenon of neuroplasticity, especially adult brain. I'm not talking about the developmental brain. It has got super plasticity, but adult brain is endowed with rich plasticity, the phenomenon of plasticity. That is a capacity to reorganize the brain circuitry as a result of experience and changes in connectivity and thought process. So that led to changes in connectivity and thought processes. So a lot of experiments then started giving importance to these synapses. So the synapses are the functional contact areas where the neurons communicate. And you can see that synaptic efficacy determines the behavior. It can modulate the behavior, it can mediate the behavior, and you can see that there is Joseph Liddox has come out with a very fantastic book called Synaptic Self. I think those who are interested in neuroscience should, I recommend them to read this Synaptic Self. He explains the emptying capabilities of this synaptic transmission. Even it can explain the mechanisms of self-awareness. Again, within the limited capacity. So here self-awareness is something different from the Vedantic philosophy talks about awareness. So now when we come to plasticity, there are many factors. We say that experience-dependent plasticity. We can talk about education itself. Learning is an important external force, and that can induce various aspects of plasticity. And in this context, we neuroscientists study meditation. Here, meditation practices, we consider it as a tool for us to understand its influence on neuroplasticity. How meditation practice brings enduring effect of plasticity on brain. Like meditation can influence brain at different levels and different ways. So you can see that meditation is one of the important tools for us to understand these capabilities. The capabilities of brain and mind, how meditation brings these capabilities through the phenomenon of plasticity. Now, by then, towards the beginning of 1990s, we can see that these neuroimaging studies, especially PET scans, MRI scans, that has revolutionized our understanding of brain, mind, and consciousness. Now, with this imaging technique, and if you have a conceptual, like the development of conceptual tools as well as the methodological tools, now we are in a better position to explore the organ of the mind, and to also to understand that even most highly complex behaviors also can be localized. So earlier, the mental processes, behavioral scientists or behavioral psychologists thought that these mental processes cannot be observable, cannot be, like localized. Whereas now with these tools, now we know that even the most highly complex behaviors are localized in different areas of the brain. And the coordinated action of these areas helps in the emergence of a coherent behavior and emergence of a coherent cognition. So we feel that, like when we talk about consciousness now, neuroscientists consider that consciousness or neural correlates of consciousness. When we talk consciousness is the neural activity associated with conscious awareness, conscious experience. Here we cannot dissociate conscious awareness alone or conscious experience alone. Here we say that it is all, we experience this as a unified cognitive experience. All our mental processes, the feeling, mental process of perceiving, mental process of thinking, perceiving, feeling, remembering, all these we experience as a unified cognitive experience, because all these are all emerged as a coordinated activity from different brain regions. So thus, neural correlate of consciousness, we have to use a reductionistic approach to understand at least these mental processes, and then dissociate consciousness. Maybe that will take another, century for us to understand. But still, we are beginning to understand various aspects of brain capabilities and mind capabilities, and that definitely, that insight will help us to understand maybe consciousness better. So coming to neural correlates of consciousness, it is the neural activity. This neural activity that is associated with us, with some mental perspectives, like feeling. So these, when we talk about the neural correlates of consciousness, we are talking about this unified cognitive experience and the minimum neural mechanism that is sufficient to generate a specific conscious percept. So the contributions of Christoph Koch, Tononi, the integrated information theory, and all Dr. Sarvapriyananda has mentioned. So again, all are on a reductionistic approach. We talk about consciousness. Now let us see that how we measure consciousness. So from, Dr. Sarvapriyananda has talked a lot about consciousness, like from waking, the different existence of consciousness at different levels, like on waking consciousness, dream consciousness, deep sleep consciousness, and turiya consciousness. So here we also talk about this from a different perspective. So from a brain perspective, from a neural perspective, when we talk, we use two correlates. One is the content of consciousness. Here, what we mean by content of consciousness? Content of consciousness, here we say about the ability of the system, the ability of the brain to integrate information. That is one aspect. Another aspect is the ability of the brain to differentiate information. So the content of consciousness depends upon the ability of brain to integrate information and to differentiate information. So that is about content of consciousness. These are all measurable. We have certain tools with which we will be able to measure these. And level of consciousness. Here, the level of consciousness, here we say that the ability of the organism, to respond to the commands. So you know that during waking consciousness, we are highly awake and we are able to respond. We are highly aware of ourselves, our surroundings, and we are able to respond to our environment. So thus, in that context, the waking consciousness, we say that this is the highest, like you can experience consciousness to the highest during waking period. And the brain activity, suppose if you take the brain activity, the brain is highly active. Now, in that perspective, you see that where is the place of sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, and dreaming. So lucid, I'm not now dissociating again various aspects of dreaming. So dreaming, you see that when you dream, the content of consciousness is increasing, whereas the level of consciousness is almost similar, whether in deep sleep or dream sleep. But the content of consciousness is, of course, totally different. Whereas when the patient is in coma or under general anesthesia, definitely the content of consciousness is reduced, the level of consciousness is reduced. So now, and again, you can classify, like the patients in vegetative state, minimally conscious state, locked-in syndrome. So locked-in syndrome, their content of consciousness is very high because they are able to actually experience everything. Only thing is they are not able to respond to the commands because of, because of their paralysis. Whereas minimally consciousness, vegetative state. So you see that they are all existing in having different levels of consciousness and different contents of consciousness. So this is how neuroscientists try to understand even whatever consciousness we say that it may be an object actually in terms of Vedantic philosophy, but still at least to understand these measures are very important for us. And we can say that we neurophysiologists, this is a bridge for us to become neurophilosophers at the end of our career. So that is one of the ultimate aim, and that is what we look forward to have this collaboration now with the Swami Vivekananda Center for Consciousness Studies. Um, and now let me come to the brain. See, we are trying to understand again how meditation, the neuroscientists utilize meditation as a tool to understand brain and mind, the capabilities of brain and mind. And this imaging studies have helped us to understand how meditation influence or modulate brain functions. The proficient practice of meditation has been shown to enhance attention, enhance awareness, enhance emotion regulation, and thus in general enhance the self-regulation. So you see that meditation has the capacity to modulate the brain functions associated with attention control. You can see that the frontoparietal network and other networks associated with cognition, emotion regulation, and awareness. So you see that the meditation has a capability, to change the property of the network properties, the neural network properties. It has the ability to change the neural network properties and to make the brain more resilient. And at the end of it, what is it? You can see that there is a lot of changes in the perspective of the self-awareness actually. You become more positive self. There is positive self-representation, more self-esteem, higher acceptance, and deep concerns and love, sympathy for others, empathy. You can see the development of altruism in you, actually, compassion in you, generosity. So you can see that there is a transformation of individual consciousness, through meditation practice. You are becoming from a self-centered, it is a journey from self-centeredness to selflessness. So we neuroscientists now try to correlate these brain changes, the material changes that is occurring in the brain, and looking at the phenomenology, looking at your behavioral changes, and then try to assume that, okay, a meditative brain, definitely the content of consciousness may be totally different from that of a normal, ordinary human, non-meditating human being. So now in this regard, see, when I talk about the content of consciousness and what you say that the difference, content of consciousness, I said that it is mainly the integration, the ability of the brain to integrate information and the ability of the brain to differentiate information so that this information will be processed at different areas of the brain. Finally, the coordinated action, will help us to have this coherent behavior or coherent cognition. So both are very important, integration of information as well as differentiation of information. And the studies, meditation practices have shown that meditation practices enhance brain oscillations. So if you decompose this brain EEG wave pattern, brain activity, you can decompose into, dissociate into various frequency waves like theta, delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, all with different frequencies. And you can see that all these are very important to mediate various cognitive functions, like theta, gamma, synchrony. So the studies have shown that meditation practices enhance integration, that enhance brain oscillation and synchrony, as well as enhance the differentiation, thus enhance the brain cognitive functions in general. So now with that introduction, I will just share with you the experiments, the studies, what we have carried out in our laboratory. We have been studying, the Vipassana meditation, the neurophysiology of Vipassana meditation in the past 20 years. And as you all know, Vipassana meditation is one of the ancient Buddhist meditative practices. And here our intention was to study, to dissociate meditation proficiency. See, so we have studied among the teachers. So we have got teachers. Teachers are having more than 10,000 hours of meditation experience. Senior practitioners of meditation, 10,000 hours of meditation experience. And novices. Novices are the new entrants. They are having only just around 1 year of meditation practice. That is around 1,000 hours of meditation experience. And why we have studied? Because we know that seniors and teachers, they would have undergone various advanced courses in Vipassana, and thus they are exposure to this philosophical basis of this meditation practice. They are very thorough with that. Whereas we say that the proficient, when compared to seniors, teachers are more proficient. because of they are more proficient due to their focused training and very continuous training, because they are teachers. So they are exposed to the theoretical underpinnings of the meditation. So you see that the meditation proficiency is not just the years of meditation alone, how you meditate. So that is very important. So we wanted to study the proficiency based meditation, changes in EEG, in brain activity while they are meditating. That is one objective we thought about it. Another objective is that when we talk about Vipassana meditation, I will come to this later. When we talk about Vipassana meditation, the meditator starts meditation with a focused attention on breathing. So breath, focusing on breath, that is the meditation begins with that. And definitely this enhances the awareness, decreases the mind wandering. And then he expands his awareness to the entire sensations and feeling, that is, he will be able to scan the entire body. And this practice actually help them to develop an equanimous mind, and also equanimous and non-reactive mind. So you are now like an object, you are just scanning your mind, your body and mind, and just observing the sensation that is arising in your body, observing the feelings that is arising in your brain, like an observer. And this also enhances awareness, and also the realization of impermanence. And like you can see that you are just evolving now slowly. And then the meditation ends with a metta bhavana. Metta bhavana is radiating goodwill, to himself as well as to others. So you see that this meditation technique itself, there are 3 different aspects of meditation, and 2 aspects, the Anapanasati and Vipassana, are cognitively intense. There is an enhancement of awareness, enhancement of attention, cognitively intense state of meditation. Whereas Metta Bhavana is an emotionally intense meditation. You are positively now enriched. You are positive vibes. You are just, giving to others. So you see that. So again, the brain state, we wanted to study these states. What are the changes that is occurring in the brain during these different states of meditation? So these are the 2 things we have studied. And one important thing what we have observed is these are the EEGs we have recorded from the novice meditator and the seniors and teachers. You look at the just enhance the synchronized oscillation of the brain. We have studied this from 128 regions of the brain, and all areas you can see that there is enhanced synchronized oscillations. That is not seen in the novice meditators. And this enhanced synchronized oscillation, as I have told you, that it is very important for integrating the information. And what we have observed, so we have just, we have decomposed these brain waves and studied these brain waves and looked at the scalp EEG, topograph, and we have observed some distinction between the teachers and seniors, as well as the teachers, seniors, and the novice. Novice, we have seen that there is novice showed enhanced delta, enhanced beta, as well as enhanced gamma. Whereas the teachers and seniors, they show high theta, that is a lower frequency range, as well as a low alpha enhancement. So you see the dissociation of EEG activity itself across the meditation groups, and even you can see the across the different state of meditation. So what we have seen is when you enter into meditation, you are entering into a different state of consciousness. It is a whatever it is a just enhanced cognitive experience, but still it is totally different from the rest period. And we have observed. So what we have, we wanted to study the state and trait effect of meditation. And what we have observed is trait effects. Trait effect is a permanent changes in EEG. That has been brought through this proficient meditative practice. We have observed this trait effect only among the teachers and seniors. And there are again distinction between teachers and seniors. Teachers showed significant differences than the seniors, even though similar observation. So we have observed an enhanced theta alpha frequency, 6 to 10 hertz frequency. And that is seen throughout across, state rest during meditation, during sleep, during even cognitive task when they are diverting their attention to carry out a task. So what does this mean? That is, there is an theta and alpha. Enhanced theta and alpha is an indication of sustained attention and awareness, positive emotion, feeling of happiness, and attainment of bliss. So, and also decrease self-referential processing, enhance objective stance towards oneself, enhance self-regulation. So you see that when you are changing your, there is a phenomenological change. You can see there is a change that is occurring in the brain also. That is from, like your mind wandering is reduced, your self-referential points are reduced, and you are becoming enhanced self-regulation, enhanced emotion regulation. At the same time, sustained attention and awareness. You are becoming, you can focus your attention. And also you are come up with positive emotions. You are come up with enhanced well-being. Here I mean the well-being. It is not just a state of happiness. It is a state of a eudaimonic well-being. Your personal growth towards altruistic nature. So this is what is meant by these changes in brain functions. And the same way, we have also seen state effects. That is, during the time of meditation, you also see enhanced alpha during Anapana and Vipassana, whereas enhanced theta during Metta. This is what I said. We can also dissociate. Anapana and Vipassana are cognitively intense, whereas Metta is an emotionally intense. And there you see enhanced theta. Enhanced theta is a reflection of mental quiescence and emotion regulation. Enhancement of purposeful attention engagement. And whereas enhanced alpha is very important. See, when you are meditating, your cortex is giving a warning that, there is enhanced alpha. So it is just like a warning. It is a gating mechanism. When there is enhanced alpha, alpha predominance in your brain, that means you are now indulging in an internalized attention. You are doing meditation. Okay, so when you are in that intense internal meditative state, internal enhanced attentive state, there is a cortical gating in terms of enhanced alpha, and that prevents the cortex from processing other sensory information. So it prevents, it prevents all other sensory information. It gives you all freedom to internalize all your attention and to be in that meditative state. Whereas novice meditators, we have seen gamma. Gamma, definitely it is very important for differentiation of information, and it is very important for processing of information. But what we think that novice meditators, they are actually effortfully engaging themselves. If the seniors and teachers can indulge in meditation effortlessly, the novice meditators, they are the beginners, they are effortfully engaging in their meditation. So it is these are indications of effortful state of consciousness, actually. I will just skip all this because I don't want to, I have to complete my talk within the stipulated time. And there are studies from the literature also, enhanced FM theta, the frontal midline theta synchrony, which is an indication of internalized attention and blissful experience. This is from Aftanas and Goltichin. They have studied this in Sahaja Yoga meditation practitioners, and they have observed intense, connectivity, across brain regions among the long-term meditators, not the short-term. Short-term meditator did not show such an intense connectivity. So intense connectivity is very important to integrate information. So you see that meditation is definitely a tool for us to understand how it can induce these various brain changes. The same way, there are studies to show enhanced gamma activity. Here they are just mentioning about enhancement of attention and cognition. So this is one aspect. Neuroscientists can we study brain activity in terms of EEG, wave patterns, and we can definitely get a lot of insight about the changes that is being brought by meditation practices. Another study, what we are concentrating is the event-related potentials. Here, the meditators now, instead of meditating, they have to perform a task. And in the laboratory, they have to perform a task. We will be giving an auditory oddball paradigm, like a frequent stimulus, rare stimulus. Rare stimulus is only 20%. We will be delivering it only for 20%. Whereas frequent stimulus is for 80% of the time, they will be hearing some sound, a normal tone. Whereas here the rare stimulus will be a very specific tone, of a different tone. So that you are given all your, this thing, that instructions that you have to press, you have to respond only to the rare tone. That is when a rare tone, and this rare tone is randomly given actually. So that means you have to, during the entire lab session, you should be very attentive, and you are just attentive to the rare stimulus, and you are pressing, you are responding to that. You get these kind of wave patterns. These wave patterns are indices of neurophysiological indices of attention, memory. So excuse me. So one can study these cognitive activities, your cognitive abilities, by looking at P300 wave pattern, various wave patterns. So when you are studying about attention and memory, we study about the P300 wave pattern, and we look at it so that you can see a beautiful distinction between these frequent stimulus. Frequent stimulus you are not attending, whereas when you are attending, your wave patterns are becoming very distinct, and very distinct from that of the frequent stimulus. So here what we have done, we have studied P300. We looked at the ERPs, but what we have seen, the beautiful change what we have seen is the P300 EEG pattern. So you dissociate now EEG during that particular 300 millisecond, during which that P300 wave originates. You study that EEG pattern alone, and we have observed a beautiful dissociation, between the teachers, seniors, and the novices. I have told you that teachers and seniors showed enhanced alpha activity during meditation, and that is very important for maintaining the internalized attention. And during the maintaining internalized attention, it is a kind of alpha gating. Whereas now, when you are diverting your attention to carry out a cognitive task, your attention is diverted now from to the external, from an internal to external. There is a beautiful dissociation of alpha. You can see that alpha totally disappears. The alpha synchrony is totally disappeared. Whereas in novice, we didn't see that kind of alpha desynchrony. Okay, and here even the novice showed enhanced theta activity, whereas the meditators showed a reduced theta activity. Again, you see that when you are diverting your attention to carry out a cognitive task, your brain functions are totally different, especially among proficient meditators. Whereas the novice meditators, they are the beginners, and they need to. These are all effortful. These are all indications of effortful meditation practice, and you have to carry out. You have to sustain your attention. It is a kind of effortfully the novice practitioners are doing, whereas the meditators, long-term meditators, the proficient meditators are achieving this effortlessly. So there are a lot of distinctions that can be studied using these tools. That is what I just wanted to convey in this. And we have also this, the source localization studies also have showed, you can just see that within 32 milliseconds of the presentation, of the stimulus, you see the recruitment of areas in the advanced meditators by 32 milliseconds itself. That itself talks about the highly resilient brain, the efficient network processing. But whereas in the novice meditator, we are not able to see anything. Even after 60 milliseconds also, you are not able to see. Whereas in meditators, long-term meditators, they have already completed their study by this time. By 300 milliseconds, we see the lighting up in the novice meditators. By that time, they have completed their study, their task, and they are coming back to normalcy, the senior meditators. So you see the dynamicity of brain dynamicity in terms of proficiency, and luckily we have the methodological tools to study all this. So how? See, for example, so when meditators have the ability to sustain their attention. Even if there is mind wandering occurring, there are certain mechanisms that detect this mind wandering and bring back your attention and awareness, to continue. So this is so beautiful that, you are all network capabilities. There is an efficient network capabilities. You have this frontoparietal network, that is attention network, that is very important for sustained attention. And this, suppose if there is a change, your mind is wandering now to outside, there are certain network, we call it as default mode network, that detect this, and that detection is through salient network. There are certain areas like insula which detect this and bring back your attention. So you see that the brain is so resilient, and everything is possible among this meditative brain. I will just show you one experiment. This experiment is very classical experiment carried out by Relchan and Polich from New York University, and there also ardent Vipassana meditators. What they have done, I have told you about the standard tone and the target tone or oddball. Whereas here in this case, they have also used a distractor sound. So distractor sound is a background noise actually. And when giving with this background noise, now you have to perform your task. You have to give attention to the oddball only, not the standard tone. In this case, the normal non-meditators, will give a lot of attention to the distractor also. And you can see that their activity pattern is so high among the normal controls, whereas meditators did not show such high activity. So you can see that they can disengage themselves from these unwanted thoughts, irrelevant to attention and cognition demanding stimuli. You will be able to just ignore all these unwanted stimuli and focus on your ongoing thought processes and go ahead. You can just study this, with the concomitant mechanism, the neural mechanisms that tells you about these abilities that is gained through, acquiring through meditation practices. So I have been talking about now the meditation and its effect on brain, mind during waking conscious states. Whereas now what happens to during sleeping brain perspective? Sleeping brain perspective is difficult to study. There aren't many studies. Only when we have started our studies in 2000, there was only one study here, Mason et al. In 1997. Mason et al. Is from Maharshi Mahayogi's group, the TM practitioners group, and they have studied their sleep pattern of TM, very long-term practitioners of TM, and they have observed some concomitant changes like a decreased EMG activity, enhanced slow wave sleep, enhanced REM density, enhanced theta alpha brain activity, and they have come to a conclusion that this is a prototype of a stabilized and evolved higher mental state. It's so interesting to see that. So what we have done, we have undertaken this as a very major study actually. We have been studying sleeping brain perspective, the influence of meditation since 2000, and we have observed that meditation enhances sleep organization. Meditation, especially among the seniors. We didn't study much about the sleep among the teachers. We have studied seniors as well as we have studied novice. We have observed that the REM sleep, the deep sleep state, as well as the slow wave sleep and the REM sleep state are higher among the senior meditators when compared to the novice meditators. So again, you can see that it helps to bring a proper sleep organization. The details of this sleep organization, definitely my co-speaker, Dr. Ravindra, my colleague, he will be enlightening you with this in his talk. So I will not be talking much about this, but still I would like to share some information about the recent study. This is a recent study we have completed. This is the recent Satyam study we have undertaken. So we have observed that what we have done, I have talked about ERPs, event-related potentials, the cognitive potentials that during the waking brain, when the person can undertake a task, a cognitive task, we get an ERP. Now, whether the sleeping brain also is possible, to respond to the stimulus. So that was the question we asked, and we provided this sound stimulus while the meditator is sleeping. Throughout the sleep, we have provided this sound stimulus. And we have observed that the brain can process these external stimulus very beautifully among the meditators when compared to the non-meditators. We can see that. So these higher wave patterns, N550 and P90, are indications that they can induce the sleep promoting mechanisms, and thus it can ensure a stability sleep. So these N550 and the P90 reflects that they can induce. So you see that even with the sound stimulus, they are inducing sound sleep among the meditators. That is one aspect. Another aspect what we have studied is, for deep sleep to occur, there are certain mechanisms in the brain. We call it as sleep spindles and delta. Sleep spindles are very important to initiate. They are the indices of brain synchronization associated with the sleep. And here, what we have observed in the meditators are, so spindles are very important. Spindle genesis is very important for the delta oscillation to occur. You see it here in controls. In controls, you can see that spindles, high spindle when compared to the meditators. Meditators, we see that very significantly reduces spindle characteristics, actually, spindle frequency among meditators without affecting the delta oscillations. So here you see this again, talks about the neuroplasticity mechanism, the meditation-induced neuroplasticity. You need not produce spindles actually to enter into the deeper sleep state. And spindles, when we talk about spindles are the gateways, are the thalamic gateways to cortex actually. So occurrence of spindle tells that now the thalamus now is not sending much information to the cortex. Okay, now when there is a reduction of spindle, what it means, there are, the cortex is now able to process information. Now, when you are providing sound, the cortex is able to process the information, and we have seen enhanced DMN activity, that is a default mode network activity, as well as insula. This is an indication of that you are also capable of. So while maintaining sleep, you have the brain mechanism even to maintain some kind of sensory awareness, about environment, about your external environment. I will just stop here because Ravindra will be elaborating upon this, whether the sense of self or the I-ness can be experienced during deep sleep. So here, so these are our future studies. Now we are going to emphasize on all these to study both whether sense of self is existing in deep sleep state, as well as whether the meditation can induce can maintain a proper sleep organization. So now, understanding all this, we feel that the meditators can experience this meta consciousness, the content of consciousnly in a sustained period of time. That is what we claim through this. So during wakefulness, during waking state, we all non-meditating, control, healthy human subjects experience basic consciousness, including feeling, including sensory feeling, perceptions, thoughts. But at times, we also can, at times you can see that we also can enter into experience this content of consciousness, but very for a short period of time. You see that, for example, I will give you one example. When you are reading, sometimes your mind wanders. But then when you realize mind wandering, you just come back to. So there are certain occasions you can also experience the content of consciousness. We call it as meta-consciousness for a short period of time. Whereas meditators, I feel that through their intense influence, enduring effect on plasticity mechanisms, by its capability to modulate the brain network functions, as well as to make brain more resilient. It can enhance the cognitive flexibility. You can now undertake a wide range of cognitive functions, cognitive activity at a time. And that is all due to enhanced network activity. And here, when developing this, you also can see that there is a phenomenological development of altruism, compassion, kindness, empathy, and so on. So this is what we see that. So we try to claim only this. Understanding consciousness from a meditative brain, we see that meditators, through their proficient meditative practice, can enhance, can sustain, can just stay in, can appreciate the content of consciousness in a sustained period of time. That's all our claim is. Definitely, we would like to study these in more details, maybe to bridge. Definitely, these exercises, we are so happy that this empirical understanding definitely help us to understand consciousness from a richer perspective of philosophy. And definitely, these kind of studies help us to bridge the gap between the philosophy and the neural perspective of consciousness. And here I would like to mention also Swami Sarvaprayananda has mentioned about David Chalmers' claims about the heart problems and the easy problems. So here we neuroscientists try to understand the easy problem. It is not the hard problem. Hard problem we have to explain about the real qualia, the real experience that we will not be able to experience or study this in detail with the available methodological tools. But I feel that the easy problems are like the integration of information and the differentiation of information. So we talk about the content of consciousness by looking at these, the ability of the brain to integrate information and to differentiate information. So we neuroscientists at present try to explain or try to understand the easy problem. And that also we don't know when we will be able to achieve this. Maybe definitely I'm so optimistic. As I said, I am a student of consciousness, and my whole aim, even to start the consciousness center, is to bridge the gap between these philosophical understanding and the neuroscience understanding, as well as to transform us to a neurophilosophers. Thank you so much for your patient hearing. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Professor Kutty, we are extremely delighted. You made a very wonderful presentation. Unfortunately, your presentation is so good that so many questions have been raised in the minds of people. But we are also running, because Swami Sarvasthananda from London, he wants to finish exactly at 1:50. So we will postpone the questions
Okay.
of your talk and Ravindra at the end of Sarvasthananda.
Yes.
So around 2 o'clock. So will you be available?
Yes. I'm going to be available throughout.
Around 2 o'clock.
Webinar.
So please, those of the audience, the listeners who are bubbling with questions, please hold your content of questioning in consciousness for some time and come out at 2 o'clock so that we'll be able to release Swami Sarvasthananda in time. So let us now pass on to Dr. Ravindra, briefly about Ravindra.
Thank you so much.